All right, today I'm joined by Dr. Tim Ball. Dr. Ball, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, James.
All right, Dr. Ball, could you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background with climate science?
Well, I was born in England, immigrated to Canada, and was in the Canadian Air Force for 9 years, where I got my first training and learning about the weather and climate, and then lost my flying category and got out of the military and went back to university and ended up getting a PhD in climatology from the University of London, England, Queen Mary College, and taught the subject for 25 years and also researched and published in the area. And since retirement, I've continued to publish and continued to work in the area of climate. And of course, I guess the interesting thing for me is that my career spans 2 climate cycles. When I started out, global cooling was the scientific consensus. Now we're into global warming, and in my opinion, we're just starting on a cooling phase again. So looks like I'm going to span three climate changes.
My name is Dr. Timothy Ball, and I have a PhD in climatology from the Queen Mary College at the University of London, England. My experience having chaired commissions of inquiry for government or being on commissions of inquiry with government is that commissions of inquiry with government there are certain things that politicians love. Commissions of inquiry are one of them. Deficits are another, because with a deficit they can say, oh, sorry, we can't afford that, but then if they want to do something, suddenly, magically, the money's there. If there's a problem or a conflict that develops and it's causing a lot of difficulty for the politicians, they can say, oh, we will appoint a commission of inquiry. It'll be independent. And that takes the heat off the issue. Oh yeah, the government's reacting. They're finally appointed a commission of inquiry. And then if they don't, of course they say, oh, you're afraid to put one on, and you're hiding something. So, okay, we appoint the commission of inquiry. But then, what people don't realize is they control the outcome of that commission of inquiry. Now, first of all, they've got the advantage now, because if the media come and say, well, what's going on? Can't talk about it. Commission of inquiry. Wait till their report comes out. Well, that delays usually 2, 3, 4 years, by which time all the political heat's off. But more important is they control it by the terms of reference. And the example I like to use is the Warren Commission inquiry into Kennedy's assassination. And Judge Warren was asked about something after. He said, well, why didn't you look? Oh, it wasn't in my terms of reference. He'd been limited by those that wrote the terms of reference. And that was my experience. One of the first cases I was asked to look at, and the minister said, he said, would you look at this? And I said, sure. And then I get the terms of reference. And I say, I can't work with that. I can't provide you with a proper answer, a complete answer with those terms of reference. And of course, then the minister says, well, sorry, that's what you got to work with. And I say, fine, then I'm not doing the job, and I'll go to the media and say, you're trying to limit the investigation here. So I could one-up him with that. And so when they set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Maurice Strong, who we should talk a lot about, he wrote the terms of reference. And the first term of reference was the definition of climate change. And he limited it deliberately to only human causes of climate change. And of course that effectively eliminated all the natural causes, natural variability, which is why you see them not looking at things like the sun and a whole bunch of other issues. And of course he then limited it even further in another term of reference, that he set it up into 3 working groups. There was the technical group, working group 1, which wrote the science report. And that was 600 of the 2,500 people. The other 1,900 were in working groups 2 and 3. Now, they were inconsequential because they had to accept the findings of Working Group 1, which were already limited by their terms of reference. So whatever their finding was, Working Groups 2 and 3 then said, okay, you telling us it's going to warm, we accept that as fact. We now look at the implications of that. And that's where you hear all these stories about, oh, the ice is going to melt, the sea level is going to rise. So really, the majority of the report by 1900 scientists is accepting without question the finding of the first group. Now, Strong, it really restricted it even more because they came out and said, look, this report is not to be used for policy. But then they set up the summary for policymakers, the absolute contradiction of that. And the summary for policymakers is written by a completely separate group. And then they write it independent of the science report. They write science reports finished and set aside. The summary for policymakers is written and given out to the media. So, for example, the last report, the fourth assessment report, came out in 2007. The summary for policymakers was released in April. The science report wasn't released till November. But the rules, the terms of reference that Strong wrote said that the summary for policymakers goes back to the science report people and says, make sure your science report agrees with what we've put in the summary. So it's like an executive of a company writing the summary of a report and then telling the employees to find the facts to agree with the summary. And it's the most unbelievable process you can imagine. So it's in those terms of reference through the IPCC that not only have you effectively eliminated most of the major causes of climate change, the natural variability. And of course, if you think about it, unless you know how much natural variability there is, how much natural climate change there is, and what are the fundamental causes of that, you can't possibly identify that fractional part that may be due to humans. But that's precisely what they're doing. And so that's why things appear so illogical and why so much is left out of the IPCC or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which have become the authority.
The International Panel on Climate Change, Environment Canada, National Geographic, and many other scientific bodies and publications assert that the average global temperature has risen by 0.6 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. This assertion is based on a dataset provided by the Climate Research Unit, headed by Phil Jones, a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. When asked by independent researcher Warwick Hughes for the raw data behind the dataset, Dr. Jones replied, "We have 25 or so years invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" Since then, Steve McIntyre also attempted to get the raw data from the UK Met Office, but his Freedom of Information request was denied, with the UK Met Office citing a secret non-disclosure agreement they had with Dr. Jones, the documentation for which they could no longer find. In Dangerous Deception, a recent article in the Canada Free Press, Dr. Tim Ball, a former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg, explains why this lack of transparency is so worrying. Recently, the Corbett Report had a chance to talk to Dr. Tim Ball about transparency, intellectual honesty, and the climate change debate.
If you're working in a lab or in a university and you're playing around with ideas and experiments and so on, there's always an academic or scientific responsibility that you have to be able to show your work and explain your work and so on. And in many cases, that's not being fulfilled. I mean, the hockey stick, where finally it was tested after how they'd done it was disclosed, saying, no, we can't, this is wrong. But when you go public and say, here's the results and this is the truth, then there's a social responsibility that kicks in. And unfortunately, and in some ways, if the politician does it, that's fine, because the credibility of politicians is so low. And the public understand they're doing it for a political motive. But when you get a scientist going public with it for a political motive, bringing the credibility of science to it, but doing it for their own political agenda, then you have really crossed that line between the scientific responsibility and the social responsibility. And in fact, I'm writing an article right now about a scientist. One of his pieces of information was that the world's warmed by 1 degree Fahrenheit or 0.6 degrees Celsius in the last 130 years. Well, he's refusing to disclose how he came up with that number. And I mean, I personally think that's almost criminal. If you are, what are you hiding? If it's just numbers, what's the problem? And he actually wrote an email to Warwick Hughes, the Australian researcher, said, how did you get this number? And he said, why should I share that with you? It took 25 years of my work, and all you want to do is find fault with it. That's a scary comment coming from a scientist. He's still blocking it, by the way. He's using the UK Met Office to claim that there's confidentiality. Now, the public might say, well, how is this a big deal? I mean, surely there's the raw data, and then anybody can get the raw data and match his numbers. But what the public need to know is that there are 4 major agencies producing global temperature on an annual basis. They come up with different numbers each year. And the number, I remember one year, it varied by 0.4 degrees Celsius. Well, if you're saying 0.6 in 100 years, and each year you're differing by 0.4, using the same data, well, the reason there's a difference is because you don't use the raw data. You adjust, you modify, manipulate the raw data. And of course, at what point are you doing it to get the result that you want? Well, if you're not willing to disclose how you came up with your number, the suspicion has to be, you cooked the books, fella. And I think if that number of 0.6, which is quoted everywhere, National Geographic have it on, the NOAA, the American National Oceanographic, they've on their website, Environment Canada used the number, and yet here the guy that produced it is not willing to explain how he got it. We got a serious problem on our hands, and of course what's interesting is nobody wants to come out and say you cooked the books. But what other explanation can you come up with for not disclosing that information? I mean, how could it be possibly secret or confidential? The difficulty is, and Tolstoy identified this 100 years ago, that if you've made a career out of selling an idea and to your friends and to your colleagues and to the world, and then you've got to be the one that comes out and says, gee, you know what I told you? Completely wrong. That's tough, very tough. And but if we're going to influence entire energy and economic programs for the world, because cap and trade, Kyoto, all of these things are based on these numbers, there is a massive, massive social responsibility. And unfortunately, there have been enough of these people that have not been willing to accept that and have crossed the line. So it isn't just that the politicians have politicized science, it's those scientists that have politicized science that are the problem.
The idea of it is that we're running out of water, and that water is fundamental to life and to economies. And by the way, if you think people get excited about oil and CO2 and these other things. Water is a much, much more volatile issue. And I can say that, having chaired public hearings on water issues where people have literally threatened to shoot each other. And so wars over water, many of them have been fought, and of course the whole development of the U.S. West is around that concept. And but what we really need to get people to understand is that, excuse me, as I said, there is no shortage of water, and there are some relatively cheap technologies for producing water. And of course, we have done a reasonably good job on cleaning up pollution of water, and because that back in the 70s was another part of the argument, was not only are we running out, but the potable water that we have, that is the drinkable water, is getting badly polluted. And there were stories back that time of places like the Cayuga River in the northeast U.S., which was officially declared a fire hazard by the local fire department because it was constantly catching on fire. So there were some serious pollution problems, but so many of those have been either shown to be not an issue or mitigated. One of them, of course, the Great Lakes was a big issue, and that has pretty well resolved itself. And so it really, the idea about peak water is just simply to try and suggest, look, we're at the top of the availability of water. From here on in, it's going to get into shorter and shorter supply, and therefore we need to have government come in and take control of it all. Because that's the ultimate goal.
Surprise! That's going to be the angle that they'll take. I could never have imagined it. I hope there's some big international body like the UN that has something up their sleeves. And if, as you mentioned earlier, of course, we have the Rio Plus 20 coming up very shortly. But unfortunately, we're also about to hit a break, so we'll take another few minutes off, and we will regroup and come back refreshed after this short break. And of course, we'll continue talking to Dr. Tim Ball, and we already have a caller on the line, so we'll come back with your calls right after this. Thank you for listening. This is Corbett Report Radio on Republic Broadcasting.
I have a feeling that in your mind you can see where this all may be heading, what the cure might be. Is there a tipping point?
I think the tipping point was when Tipper left Al, but that's the question is, well, the motive, of course, was implied in that comment by Maurice Strong. They want one world government, right? And they think that nationalism and individual nations simply have got to disappear. And that's why they wanted something that was global in its threat, and argued that no one government could manage it. They came very close. In 2009, there was a conference was supposed to be held in Copenhagen. It was held, actually, in Copenhagen, at which they were going to finalize the carbon tax for the world. That was going to fund all of this one world government, and it was going to be done through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which of course is another of these great overarching, unaccountable bureaucracies. And these people really believe that only they can run the world, that it's got to be one world government, and that's the only way. Maurice Strong certainly believes that. Maurice Strong grew up in southern Manitoba, on the prairies, in the dirty 30s. So he, the hard times, you could see why he had a leaning towards socialism. His sister, by the way, has been a lifelong Marxist, and everybody's entitled to their political opinion, but she's much more extreme about it than he is. But that's the agenda. They want one world government. They want to get rid of national governments and individualism. But of course, that's also going on within every country. It's the suppression of the individual to the greater good, and they'll use whatever vehicle that they claim you're threatening or will bring about the end of the world or the end of the nation as a vehicle to control you. So that's really what's happening. So just leave me alone, eh?
Amen.